This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neatsahone, and today I'm continuing with my Murders at Karlov Manor set review. So far I've looked at all the multicolored and colorless cards, and today we're going to take a look at the white ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I go through these cards. First, because we're only talking about Draft and Sealed, I'm only going to be talking about cards that can be found in Play Boosters. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play Boosters now also contain cards from the list and special guests, which combined is about 50 cards that are effectively a bonus sheet, and I'll be addressing those cards in their own video after we get through the main set. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have this set review done in time for the pre-release, and that of course means I'll be wrong about some things. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have actually turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you'll get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at the white cards in Murders at Karlov Manor. First up, we've got Absolving Lamu, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/3 Lamu at uncommon. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, all suspected creatures are no longer suspected, and when it dies, you gain 3 life and suspect up to 1 target creature an opponent controls, and the reminder text tells you what all this suspect stuff means. A suspected creature has menace and can't block. This looks really good to me. A 5-mana 4/3 flyer that gains 3 life when it dies is a card you'd already be reasonably happy with, probably a C+. This is because it pressures your opponent effectively, and the fail case is that it trades with a removal spell or a creature and gains you those 3 life. So the fact this also shuts off suspect across the board is pretty sweet. If you're in white, you're probably not using suspect a whole lot yourself. It shows up the most in red and black, so if that ability does something, it will usually power down the opposing board. Then on top of all of that, the Lamu lets you suspect an opposing creature when it dies. Sure, there's both upside and downside associated with it, but because you're making the choice, you can usually find an advantageous way to use it, and it's also a May trigger, so you don't have to if you don't want to. This does a ton for the mana cost while sporting a fairly good stat line, making it a very good uncommon, giving it a B. Next up, it's Assemble the Players, which for 1 generic and a white is a rare enchantment. It says you may look at the top card of your library anytime. Once each turn, you may cast a creature spell with power 2 or less from the top of your library. So this is a little better than it looks at first because of how it interacts with the disguise mechanic. This is sort of a revamped version of Morph, where a card with Disguise has a mana cost, and then you pay 3 generic mana, play that card face down, and it's a 2/2 with Ward 2, and you can turn it up at any time for its Disguise cost. Because this doesn't look at the card, it looks at the spell, that means you'll be able to cast any Disguise creature off the top of your library, provided you play it face down. So I think having a deck where you have enough creatures that naturally have 2 power, plus all your Disguise creatures is doable, but this is still probably a build around. If you only have like 5 or 6 cards that meet this requirement, it's not worth playing. But I think having 10 plus creatures is plenty doable. It's probably a D+ in your typical white deck, and a B in a deck that can build around it. When you do that, this will feel like it draws you an extra card pretty often. Next up, it's Aurelias Vindicator, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 4/2 angel at Mythic Rare. It's got flying, lifelink, and ward 2, and it has disguise for X, 3 generic, and a white. When it's turned face up, exile up to X other target creatures from the battlefield and/or creature cards from graveyards. When it leaves the battlefield, return the exiled cards to their owner's hands. So, without disguise, this card is already pretty great. A 4-mana 4/2 with flying, lifelink, and ward 2 can do a ton of work. And if your opponent can't find a way to deal with it quickly, something that's made difficult thanks to ward, it's going to end up causing all kinds of problems for them. The race will get completely out of control. You're frequently just going to play this face up early because of that, but it also has some insane late game upside where you play it face down and then turn it face up. The exile effect is reminiscent of Angel of Serenity in that the stuff it exiles can go back to players' hands. This means that you can do double duty with the effect. You can use it to remove stuff of your opponents, but for insurance, you can also exile some stuff from your graveyard so that if your opponent does find a way to kill the Vindicator, you're going to get some cards back too. I think the whole package here is a bomb. It's nuts on turn 4 and completely insane in the late game. I'm giving this an A+. Next up, it's Auspicious Arrival. For 1 generic and a white, it's a common instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Investigate. Investigate means you make a clue token, which is an artifact with 2 generic, sack this artifact, draw a card. This is a solid trick, one that can represent a 2-for-1, thanks to the clue. +2/+2 for 2 isn't the most impressive boost to cost ratio, but it's fine. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Call a Surprise Witness, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon sorcery. It says return target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, put a flying counter on it. It's a spirit in addition to its other types. We've seen 2-mana spells that reanimate small creatures and give them a little buff work out reasonably well of late, and I think this is another one of those. It does take setup and a deck made up of the right composition, but I don't think it will be hard to feel like you're getting a good deal out of this when you cast it. I'm giving it a C+. You probably don't ever want more than one, because it is pretty bad if you have it in your opening hand, for example, but I do think that first copy is a C+. Next up, it's Case File Auditor, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/4 human detective at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield and whenever you solve a case, look at the top 6 cards of your library. You may reveal an enchantment card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast case spells. So case is a new enchantment subtype. We're about to see the white ones. And how good this card's going to be is going to depend on how consistently you can get a hit with the Enter the Battlefield ability. This format has enough enchantments, including cases in white, for this to happen a decent chunk of the time. I think having 5 enchantments is somewhat realistic, and I think you'll hit often enough for this to work. And obviously you're going to need cases to get the full value out of this, but they aren't so plentiful that that's always going to be easy. For example, in white, there are 2 uncommons and a rare. Still, I think white decks will be capable of doing enough work with this, mostly off of that Enter the Battlefield ability, for it to be a C+. Next up, it's Case of the Gateway Express, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment case. When it enters the battlefield, you choose target creature you don't control. Each creature you control deals 1 damage to that creature. And what makes cases unique is that they have a requirement you have to fulfill. In other words, you solve it. In this case, you need 3 or more creatures to attack in a turn. And then if you do that, it gets solved during your end step. And then once it's solved, it gets another effect. Creatures you control get +1/+0. This looks like a really good case to me. The Enter the Battlefield ability will be a reasonable removal spell most of the time, and sometimes a really good one. In this case, is easier to solve than most. The reward isn't exactly game-breaking, but it's certainly relevant, especially because it's effectively stapled to a solid removal spell. I'm giving this a B+. Next up, it's Case of the Pilfered Proof, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment case. Whenever a detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, put a +1/+1 counter on it. You solve this one by controlling 3 or more detectives, and if it's solved, if 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, those tokens, plus a clue token, are created instead. I don't like this one very much. First, you have to play it in the right order. You have to play it ahead of your detectives to get the counters, and that's where most of the value is, because getting an extra clue here anytime you investigate isn't the most impressive payoff. If you can consistently play this on turn 2 in your detective deck, it's going to feel pretty good, but it just seems so mediocre at any other stage in the game that I think it's probably just a D. Next up, it's Case of the Uneaten Feast, which for 1 white mana is a rare enchantment case. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. To solve it, you have to gain 5 or more life this turn. Once it's solved, you can sacrifice it, and creature cards in your graveyard gain. You may cast this card from your graveyard until end of turn. Solving this gives you an awesome payoff. The only problem is, this format doesn't really have a major life gain theme, and the Feast doesn't gain you enough life on its own to get it done. It's not going to be impossible to solve this and start casting stuff from your graveyard, but this does need a build-around grade because it's probably just an F in your typical white deck in the format. The life gain effect just doesn't do enough when that's all this card does. But if you have a few ways to gain life, and maybe a few cards that make multiple bodies, you're going to end up being able to make this work, though I think the chances of doing that are unfortunately kind of low. For that reason, I think its ceiling is probably only a B. Obviously, if it was really easy to solve, it would be a bomb, but I just don't see that happening in the format. Next up, it's Defenestrated Phantom, which for 4 generic and 2 white is a 4/3 flyer at common. It's got Disguise for 4 generic and a white. So, no matter how you cast this, you're not really getting a good deal. You do still have the upside of having this big old flyer that you can cast in the early game, but like I said, it's never going to feel that good, even if it's not terrible either. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Delny Streetwise Lookout, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/2 legendary human scout at Mythic Rare. Creatures you control with power 2 or less can't be blocked by creatures with power 3 or greater. If an ability of a creature you control with power 2 or less triggers, that ability triggers an additional time. People are excited about this card in Commander, but I think it's not very good in Limited. The evasiveness this grants is kind of okay, though there will be plenty of situations where it doesn't do anything, even in a set with Disguise. As a result, you're really going to need to be getting extra triggers out of this for it to be something you want to add. So the big idea here is that you can send in your disguised creatures, theoretically, have them be unblockable, and then be able to flip them, but this evasiveness she gives you just isn't good enough for you to rely on that actually happening. So you need to have a lot of disguised creatures, some of which have triggers, but keep in mind when they turn face up, if they no longer have 2 power, they're not going to get the extra trigger. So it's just going to be pretty difficult for you to end up with enough creatures with triggered abilities for this to be worth it, and I just don't see the evasive effect working out as well as it could. So I think this is probably just a D. Next up, it's Doorkeeper Thrall, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/2 Thrall at rare. It's got flash and flying. Artifacts and creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. This is a pretty sweet hate bear for 60 card formats, but significantly less impressive in Limited. This is because your deck is pretty likely to have effects that this shuts down too, so you have to be careful about when you play it. That said, you do get to decide when you play it, and casting it in response to a creature with an ETB or something is likely to feel pretty good, especially because it has a reasonable stat line, giving this a C+. Next up, it's Due Diligence, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters the battlefield, target creature you control other than enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and gains vigilance until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2 and has vigilance. Without the ETB, this would be a D- level enchantment. It's just too risky and underwhelming to be worth playing unless you're really desperate. If you throw the enter the battlefield trigger in the mix, it does get better. There are going to be times where you cast this and end up with 2 great attacks as a result, and the vigilance makes it so you don't have to give up on defending yourself either, so chances are better than normal that those attacks are worth taking. You do, of course, need to be careful about casting this as you do with most auras, but this one does enough up front to make the cut a decent chunk of the time. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Essence of Antiquity, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 1/10 artifact creature golem at uncommon. It has Disguise for 2 generic and a white, and when it's turned face up, creatures you control gain hexproof until end of turn, untap them. A 5-mana 1/10 is kind of okay, I guess. It can block for days, although its lower power will make it unable to kill most things. The disguise part is pretty sweet here, though. You're usually going to play this face down and have it lie in wait as a 2/2 up until you reach a point where transforming it is advantageous. This will most frequently be when you can use it to blank a removal spell, but it turning into a 1/10 can be valuable all on its own, as can untapping your whole board. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Forum Familiar, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 creature cat at uncommon. It has Disguise for 1 generic and a white, and when it's turned face up, you may return another target permanent you control to its owner's hand and put a +1/+1 counter on Forum Familiar. This is a disguised creature that you're going to want to play face down like 99% of the time, since if you don't, it's just a vanilla 1-mana 1/1, and those tend to get irrelevant quickly. However, if you play this face down, it's going to be pretty darn relevant thanks to its ability to bounce your permanents. You can do this to rebuy into the battlefield abilities or help a creature dodge removal and stuff like that, but you can even just return a land if you just want the familiar to be a 2/2. Obviously that's not optimal, but it's something. I think this will lie in wait and have big impacts on many games. This also gives us back-to-back white disguised creatures at uncommon who can turn face up and blank removal, so that's something you're going to have to keep in mind against white decks. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Griff Not Tracker, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 human detective at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 2 target cards from a single graveyard. 4 mana 3/2 flyers aren't what they once were, but hating on the graveyard has value, and the stat line isn't a complete disaster. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Hazda Vigilante, which for 4 generic and a white is a 4/4 giant soldier at common. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control with power 2 or less. If you can get a counter out of this, the rate on this will feel fine. Doing so doesn't seem like a big stretch with Disguise around either. It's nice he does it on attacks too, so getting 2 counters out of him is a real possibility, but I still don't really love this stat line, giving this a C. Next up, it's Inside Source, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/1 human citizen at common. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. You can pay 3 generic and tap it, and target detective creature you control gets +2/+0 and gains Vigilance until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. 3 mana for a 2/2 and a 1/1 is always a pretty good rate in limited, so when you tack on this card's ability to buff your detectives, albeit inefficiently, I think we're talking about a nice common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Karlov Watch Dog, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 dog at uncommon. It's got Vigilance. Permanents your opponent's control can't be turned face up during your turn. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. This is a nice battalion trigger. Red-white in this format should be pretty good at getting this going, and obviously the boost it gives is at its best when you have a bunch of creatures anyway. The stats boost also makes it very likely that you'll keep enough stuff alive to do it all over again the next turn. The card's big downside is being a 4 mana card with 2 toughness that can be killed by almost every removal spell in the format, including 1 mana ones, and that's a miserable feeling. The fact that you shut off your opponent's ability to turn their creatures face up during your turn is nice too, although frequently they do a lot more damage when they get turned face up during your opponent's turn anyway. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Krovod Haunch, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon food equipment. This equipped creature gets +2/+0. You can pay 2 generic, tap it, and sacrifice it to gain 3 life because it's a food. Whenever it's put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you can pay 1 generic and a white. If you do, you create 2 1/1 white dog creature tokens, and it equips for 2. 1 to play and 2 to equip for +2/+0 is not great, but the nice thing here is once this isn't really meaningful to equip to your creatures, you can just throw it away to make 2 1/1 tokens and gain some life. Neither mode is amazing, but the modality here does give this 2 pretty decent use cases, so I think it's a C. Next up, it's Make Your Move, which for 2 generic and a white is a common instant. Destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with power 4 or greater. We see this type of removal that only hits big creatures all the time, and it's usually pretty mediocre, simply because it's too narrow. They usually don't even make the cut in your main deck, but stapling Disenchant to it is a pretty big upgrade, especially in a set that has a fair number of both enchantments and artifacts, and that probably makes it a solid playable. Neither enchantments nor artifacts are so plentiful that this is going to be great, but I think it's a C. Next up, it's Makeshift Binding, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Makeshift Binding leaves the battlefield. You gain 2 life. This is an excellent common. Even if it didn't gain you 2 life, it's premium removal, and once you tack that on, we're talking about arguably the best white common in this set. Removing something and gaining life at the same time is one of the best ways to get back ahead from behind, giving this a B. Next up, it's Market Watch Phantom, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 spirit detective at common. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, Market Watch Phantom gains flying until end of turn. This feels like a pretty important common for aggressive white decks. That type of deck will have tons of cards that trigger this, including their disguised creatures, and it doesn't seem like it will be rare for this to crack in as a flyer on turns 3 and 4. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Museum Nightwatch, which for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 Centaur Soldier at common. When it dies, you create a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token, and it has disguise for 1 generic and a white. Spending 4 mana to get a 3/2 and a 2/2 is pretty decent, and you can disguise this to keep your opponent from knowing that it will leave value behind. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Neighborhood Guardian, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 uncommon unicorn. Whenever another creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, target creature you control gets +1/+1 until end of turn. +1/+1 is nice and all, but it's not amazing when you have to jump through some pretty specific hoops to make it happen. And sure, there's lots of disguise in this set that will trigger this, not to mention creature tokens, which will probably feel even better, but this still just feels like a C to me. Next up, it's No Witnesses, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a rare sorcery. Each player who controls the most creatures investigates, then destroy all creatures. So, this is Wrath of God, but a little worse if your opponent has the most creatures, and a little better if you do. Sweepers are obviously enormously powerful, but they do get awkward and limited if you're the aggro deck. They are at their best when you're behind, and uncastable if you're ahead, so they're always hard to evaluate. I usually land somewhere around a B+. Next up, it's Not On My Watch, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon instant. It says exile target attacking creature. If you're in the market for this, it's super efficient. The problem is, lots of white decks aren't really in on this kind of effect. If you're an aggro deck, this isn't very good, because you want removal that lets you get blockers out of the way. If you're not aggressive though, this is premium removal. That makes it kind of a weird card to evaluate, but I think a C+ is fair. It's niche enough that you don't really want to take it super early in the draft, but if it starts to become clear you're a slower deck, this is a card you should move way up in your pick order. Next up, it's Novice Inspector, which for 1 white mana is a 1/2 human detective at common. When it enters the battlefield, you investigate. This is a functional reprint of Thraben Inspector, which was a great 1-drop in Limited, and a great 1-drop in lots of 60-card formats too. You get these 2 pieces of material for only 1 mana, and that's just really good, giving this a B-. Next up, it's On the Job, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a common instant. Creatures you control get +2/+1 until end of turn, investigate. As usual with these inspiring charge effects, this is a build around. Red-white decks look the most well positioned for this, as they can go the widest, but you really need to be all in on curving out and going wide, or this isn't worth playing, even with the clue. It's probably a D-level card in your typical white deck, but a card you're usually going to be happy with one of in most of your really aggressive decks. Maybe it has a ceiling around a C+. Next up, it's Perimeter Enforcer, which for 1 generic into white is a 1/1 uncommon human detective. It's got flying and lifelink, and whenever another detective enters the battlefield under your control, and whenever a detective you control is turned face up, Perimeter Enforcer gets +1/+1 until end of turn. A 2-mana 1/1 with flying and lifelink is already pretty nice, a great creature to enhance, and this will often enhance itself in a format with this many detectives, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Sanctuary Wall, which for 1 generic into white is a 0/4 artifact creature wall and uncommon. It's got Defender. You can pay 2 generic into white and tap it to tap target creature. You may put a stun counter on it. If you do, put a stun counter on Sanctuary Wall. The tap effect here is overcosted, even with the stun counter option, especially because the wall stuns itself too when you do the stun counter thing. Still, if you use it on your opponent's turn, you're going to get rid of that stun counter first, and the wall will be ready to go by the time your opponent's stun creature gets untapped again. Overall, though, I think this is too overcosted for what it is, and the baseline isn't impressive either. I don't think this makes the cut most of the time, giving it a D. Next up, it's Seasoned Consultant, which for 1 generic into white is a 1/3 human detective at common. Whenever you attack with 3 or more creatures, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This will feel pretty nice when it attacks as a 3/3. That's kind of a relevant body all game long, but it probably won't be doing that until like turn 4, so it isn't going to be lighting the world on fire either. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's 10th District Hero, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/3 human at rare. You can pay 1 generic and a white and collect evidence 2. This isn't a mechanic we've seen so far in any white cards. It's not on very many of them, but what collect evidence 2 means is that you can exile cards from your graveyard with a mana value equal to or greater than the collect evidence value, in this case 2. And in this case, it's part of the cost, and then this becomes a human detective with base power and toughness 4/4 and gains vigilance. You can then pay 2 generic and a white and collect evidence 4. It becomes a legendary creature named Maleva the Stalwart. It has base power and toughness 5/5, and it gains other creatures you control have indestructible. This is an awesome 2-drop. The 2/3 stat line is a nice starting point, and if you have the mana and the cards in your graveyard, you can maybe make it a 4/4 vigilance right away, or in the late game, a 7-mana 5/5 that makes all your stuff indestructible. Obviously enough, you're usually going to pay in installments, but the fact that you can draw this early and have it be an amazing threat, or draw it late and have it be an amazing threat, makes it an excellent card. I'm giving it a B+. Up next, it's Unyielding Gatekeeper, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/2 Elephant Cleric at rare. It's got Disguise for 1 generic and a white. Whenever it's turned face up, exile another target non-land permanent. If you controlled it, return it to the battlefield tapped. Otherwise, its controller creates a 2/2 white and blue detective creature token. The best thing you can do with this when you turn it face up is to help your creature dodge removal, which, yeah, that's a 3rd white disguised creature that can do that, but at least this one's rare. But this can also rebuy into the battlefield abilities, can get rid of problematic non-land permanents, opponents control, and give them a detective instead, which normally isn't a great effect, but when it's attached to a creature, it gets a lot better, and sometimes your opponent's gonna have something really scary that you're very happy to turn into a detective, and then this has an okay fail case as a 2-mana 3/2, giving this a B. Next, it's Wojack Investigator, which for 2 generic and a white is a 2/4 Angel Detective at rare. It's got flying and vigilance, and at the beginning of your upkeep, investigate once for each opponent who has more cards in hand than you. A 3-mana 2/4 with flying and vigilance is easily a B, and this can crank out clues a decent chunk of the time. I really like the design on white card draw lately, because they're using white's obsession with balance as part of the flavor. Anyway, this looks quite good to me, and I think you'll get those clues often enough for this to sneak into the lower bomb range, giving it an A-. And our last white card is Wrench. For 1 white mana, it's an uncommon artifact clue equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has vigilance, and pay 3 and tap to tap target creature. And you can pay 2 generic and sacrifice the Wrench to draw a card, because it's a clue, and you can equip it for 2. There's a whole cycle of these clue equipments, and they're all solid or better because they offer kind of okay effects while also having the ability to be thrown away for something else when the equipment doesn't do enough. The stats boost here isn't the most efficient thing ever, and the tap effect is expensive, but it certainly isn't a bad mana sink, and the fact you can swing with something, keep it untapped, and leave mana up for the tap effect is going to be pretty nice at lots of stages of the game. I'm giving this a C. So those are all the white cards in Murders at Karlov Manor. Tomorrow, I'll be back to take a look at all the blue cards. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to make sure you're caught up on the set reviews so far, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to get access to some set review related perks, you can do so by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.